Okay. In my preparation for coming here, I did watch some of the YouTube videos from your radio channel, Manx TV, whatever you call it, and I saw the lady I was on with today make a statement and things. So I thought I'd do some simple calculations. Someone to challenge these calculations. Now, your utility company are not going to do this because they're too sensible. But this is what people propose when they don't know what they're talking about. So we're talking about storage. Now, the best storage would be, if you could do it, you can't, is pump storage. It's a great system. But I'm talking about storage to balance the wind. Because you may not know it, I know Manx may be different with its southwesterly, dead on 30 miles an hour, only 5% variation, but it doesn't actually work like that in the rest of the world. So we need storage to balance it. It's only 2 minutes long, this video, and it's a story about storage. I have trouble sometimes understanding the world around me, and in engineering what we do is we scope things. We see, are they even in the same ballpark to be viable? We're going to talk now for a few minutes really about battery storage and the madness of the world on that. Your Green Party leader in the Isle of Man is on Manx Radio featuring what her preferred backup storage is for wind. So let's cut to that first.
We've talked about many times about the base load at the power station, i.e. Making sure that people can turn the microwaves on when the wind doesn't blow. So where do you think the base load should come from? Should we retain Pulrose Power Station and burn gas, or what should happen?
So, sure that there's been lots of reports on this, and that they are going to have to overlap somewhat as we roll out the renewable investment. Basically, we would need some kind of storage, so battery systems would be perfect, and ideally it would allow to work in between when it's nice and sunny, so we can use lots of solar, and then when the wind isn't blowing, you've got that battery storage source of power.
Easy to spend other people's money, isn't it, and suggest things that are absolutely absurd. So let's just examine the cost of the battery system for the Isle of Man. Well, here we have a very good example. It's the Pillswood battery. We have the size of it there, and it is 196 megawatt hours of storage, and it can produce at a rate of 98 megawatts. So it can last about 2 hours at 98 megawatts. So that is what we're going to look at the cost of. How much does that cost? To find that out, 75 million. So that's what you get for 75 million. And typically, because it's a green sort of project, they claim it can power 300,000 UK homes for 2 hours. So it can supply 96 megawatts at that rate, 1,000 homes for 2 hours. How much is that per home? So 98 megawatts is 98,000 kilowatts. Divide that by the 300,000 homes and you get 0.32 kilowatts per home. That's 320 watts, which is not enough to drive a kettle. 1,000 watts. Not the 3,000 watt needed to drive a basic heat pump even. This is a lie. This is total deception. But it is normal in the green industry. But back to the Isle of Man and what the cost would be to back up your energy supply. Well, Pittswood cost 75 million for 196 megawatt hours. Right? The Isle of Man needs about 1,100 megawatt hours a day, about that on average. That's 45.8 megawatt hours per hour, with a peak of say 80 megawatts. 96 megawatt hours divided by your 80 peak, you'd last for 2.45 hours. But an average rate, you'd last for 4.27 hours. So somewhere between 2 and 4.5, 5 hours is what you're going to get for 75 million. The problem is that you can have 9 days like you had in 2018 when there was hardly any wind at all. In that case, you'd need 9,900 megawatt hours, which works out to 50 times 75 million, so 3.787. That's 3,787 million. You'd probably need to replace that battery every 10 or 15 years. But there does seem to be one remaining hope for the Isle of Man Green Party, and it's this. Because of the wonderful thing. We're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. I was sale today, don't worry, it's all coming down half price. By the way, if we electrified all the cars and light vans in the UK, we'd use up the world's resources of batteries. It's used up in some minerals, it's used up 85, 90% of what the world's got. As you apply that onto the market, the costs would just go like this. Yes? And the costs are going to be rising tremendously. Right? Copper, I've got graphs of copper and the price used to be there. And as we've used, demand has gone in for this madness, the copper price has become literally, 10 to 15. It's going like that. Yes? Because of the madness of the world on this. So I do like the Yellow Brick Road. It's one of my favourite things there. All the conferences in the world, and this is the CO2 graph of the world, not published by me, it's published by NOAA. The sound on the microphone got a bit distorted in this section, but all I did was introduce this graph showing the CO2 growth in the world published by NOAA, and it has on it all the climate conferences that make no difference at all to the growth of CO2. So everything we're doing doesn't make any difference at all, and we're burning more fossil fuels today than ever in the history of man. But we have to pretend, do we? So I'm going to tell you another truth now. Net zero ain't going to happen, because people will revolt, because our politicians have lost the plot. They really have. And I mean that everywhere. I mean that in Britain, right? So they've lost the plot, and it won't be allowed to happen, which is why already, gas used to be a fossil fuel, no longer. In Europe, now it's considered green. So what you do is you change the science by changing the legislation. Doesn't matter what you observe anymore. You've got to believe what they want you to believe, regardless of what you observe. Of course, it's a fossil fuel, right? So just show you that. Now, I'm going to talk about a history to do. So I'm going to start on the CO2 graph. And I really want everyone to really listen to me on this. It's the most important part for me. First, the history is not too important. It's a background. When I come to the science, it's really important to get a message over. Because I'll tell you now, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. I'll tell you now, CO2 does warm the planet. I'm not arguing with that. But I'm going to go into the proper science of it. Right? So let's go and have a look at this. And here we have, going back 550 million years, all the geological periods since then. On that graph, in blue, it's plotted the CO2 levels going back in geological time. And you can see here, we start at between 7 and 8,000 parts per million. Compare that to today's 420 parts per million. But as life buried that CO2, the CO2 diminished and diminished over time, until by the end of the Permian, there had been the greatest extinction ever, and the cause was the lack of CO2. But salvation, not to worry. The Triassic breakup of Pangaea, that huge continent, commenced, and the volcanic activity increased the levels of CO2 right up to the end of the Jurassic there. But then it started to decrease until today we were down to 280 parts per million pre-industrial. Had we carried on at the same trajectory in just 2 million years, life would have ceased to exist on Earth. It would have buried its own life gas, CO2. Right, in the atmosphere at the moment, it varies, by the way, and I've got a CO2 meter here. Now, normally we say it's about 420-ish at the moment. That's the sort of standard for the world. It does vary around the world. In this room now, 3,488. You know why? You're breathing it out. How many parts per million? Yeah, let's call it 420, 422, 425. How many parts per million do you breathe out? Anyone guess? 5%. No, not percent. How many parts per million? A number. Outside, you got 420-ish. What do you breathe out? You breathe out 40,000 parts per million. 40,000 parts per million. There's an old wives' tale. If you talk to your plants, they grow better. They were right. It's true, right? So submarines, you're living in 3,000, somewhere 3,000 to 4,000. By the end of the evening, be over 4,000 in here. Submariners live in 8,000. CO2, I know Greta can see it, but no one else in the world can see it. It's an invisible gas, right? And I'm going to go into quite a thing about it. But what's happened there is the original animals, when we had the biggest explosion of life on Earth, was in 550 million years ago. And that explosion, the animals kept eating each other. So some animal got the crafty idea, of growing a shell. And by the way, why weren't the seas acid when it was 7,000 parts per million? They weren't, right? It's ridiculous, right? So they started to grow shells. Another one got bigger ideas, bigger shells. But as they died, they buried it. Limestone is tiny little creatures, zooplankton, with shells on. 40% of limestone. So concrete in buildings is all fossils. These are all dead animals surrounded by, which is why they don't like the cement industry, because when they grind up limestone to make cement, they release a lot of CO2. Yes? So CO2 has a history like that. And the problem is, it went low in the middle, notice. At the last glaciation, it went to 180 parts per million. Death comes, life ceases to exist. They can't recover at 150. Became that close. And, well, you'll see more in a minute. So CO2 was really desperately low. We've been in a CO2 famine. You'll hear the story. That's the highest level it's been for 100. I'm going on proper scales here. I've just been on a 550 million scale. I'm now going to come down to less than 500,000 years. Yes? And we're going to study it. Okay? The sources are mainly on the videos, by the way. Right? I should start. Well, this is a graph of the last 415,000 years. So to put that in perspective, whilst we've been looking at over 500 million years, we're now looking at less than 500,000 years, and it's a period of glaciations. The Earth today is in an ice age. It's in an ice age as long as we've got polar ice caps. But in that ice age, we have glaciations. That's where you get 0.5 mile of ice or so above Birmingham. And at times we get respites. And you can see from this graph that bulk of the time here, we're in glaciations. That is the norm. But occasionally we get the little breaks. And these little breaks are between 10 and 15,000 years long. And the one we're in today, called the Holocene, we're into 11,000 years of it already. So at any time in the next 1,000 years or so, any time really, we can go into the next glaciation. That is just a fact. So what I'm now going to do is go into the Holocene, the period we're in now, where we're 10 or 11,000 years into it. So let's look at the next graph. We are now looking at just the last 10,000 years or so. And this is where we are today. Well, it's actually 2007 when this graph was done. But as you can see, we came out of the previous glaciation here, and we reached our Holocene maximum temperature here around about 8,000 years ago. You know, we've had high ones since. There was one, actually, just around about 3,000 years ago. And then another one about 2,000 years ago, we call the Roman warm period. And one about 1,000 years ago, which was the medieval warm period. But this is where we are today. Okay, now I'll be going on now to the next one, because we're going to zone in on time again. Yeah? And this one is the last 300 years. Now this graph here, on this blue line here, shows the growth of CO2 since 1850, when the Industrial Revolution started, although it didn't really get going until about 1960, as you can see here. And then it grew, and it's still growing at this fast pace. But look at the temperature record. The temperature record started way back 150 years before the Industrial Revolution. So now look at the temperatures as we've had them increase since the end of the 1600s, and look at the CO2. Why would you claim there's a relationship between the two? A point to make here is, and I do this almost all the time, I ask them, what level of CO2 do you want? Because they've got this idea that just like a room thermostat, you can dial in, yeah? These are the climate deniers. I know there's tons of natural climate changes. I know that. I'm going to talk about some of them, yeah, as we go into this. I know that. But they are the deniers. They want it all level. They can dial down. If we just reduce this CO2, we're now going to have a peaceful life. The storms are going to decrease. Everything's going to be better, right? That's their argument. They are the climate deniers, right? They're denying, basically, that we can't control it. Okay, so that's that. But let's carry on. Questions? No questions? I don't mind if it's no question. Yeah, question.
Thank you. Being a scientist myself and having studied environmental control and pollution,
Yes.
where did the data come from that you have used for the time when man was not on Earth?
Right. For this, they were on it actually. Greenland ice cores for the 400 and odd thousand years one, and ocean sediments. They started to investigate them in the 1950s from ocean sediments. But besides that, regardless of the science, there's photographs of trailing ice shells alongside people. They're enormous, right? There is no doubt from all the fossil record that happened in the Cambrian. There is no doubt about it at all. So on my videos, when I deal with this, I go into a lot more detail, obviously. I'm covering a huge subject tonight. So it's critical. Your question is critical, where I get my data from. But if you looked at it, it said Greenland ice cores, or it said, where I get it from. What the first graph didn't say it because, but it's a story. The story is simple. It's basically sea sediments, yes? And they use the isotopes. There's different isotopes, as you may know, and they use those to get them. But there's not really a great deal of disagreement about this because, we know. All coal, the Earth doesn't produce coal anymore because all coal was made in the Carboniferous period. We agree? Yeah? And when it fell down, there were no bugs to eat it. And when it got buried and under pressure, we got coal. Until one day a bug got the great idea, let's eat the bloody trees. Yeah? So they started to eat the trees. And that was the end of the Carboniferous period then, because now when trees fall down, they rot. Yes? And that is why coal seams aren't being formed again today. So we know this. Geologists are the strongest people on my side, people who study the history of climate and geologically. I actually a producer contacted me and he said, Paul, are you willing to debate a top world scientist in the London Palladium? I can hire it for 27,600 a night, but I reckon I can sell the tickets. Yeah? And I said, yes. So we have a Zoom call. So he chose the most popular book in the world at the time, The Physics of Climate Change, and the professor came on Zoom. And I said, I don't disagree with your maths, but your data's wrong. He said, I don't know my data. So he published a book without knowing his data. So he said, can we have another meeting? I want to bring another professor on. He's famous for Snowball Earth. Yeah, famous for Snowball Earth. So he came on. And in that meeting, we discussed things. And the other thing in the first meeting, he said, when I mentioned the hockey stick, which is probably the most famous graph in the whole of climate science, he said to me, there's no such thing, Paul. And I said, it's a temperature record the last 1,000 years at that time. He said, no, Paul, you're confused. And the producer was shattered afterwards. He said, he doesn't know it. He doesn't even know the existence of the hockey stick. So we got to the second one, and I said, at one point I said, well, we know the Black Spruce Forest in the medieval warm period was 80 miles north in Canada. And roughly, a rule of thumb, for every degree centigrade you get in increase, you move the temperature up 80 miles, roughly. It's a rule of thumb. So if we did go up 1°C, you'd have the temperature, a bit better temperature. You'd have a nice weather, right? And all the warming on both sides, the climate alarmists and myself, all agree that the warming and cooling happens from the globes inwards. It doesn't happen the equator out. So, and so that happened with the scientists. And then I said, yeah, will you debate both of us? So I said, yes, I'll debate both of you. Why? Look, if I'm wrong, I would rather be put out of my ignorance. So I don't mind being wrong. I'm a scientist who wants to be wrong because I find that exciting, right? So it doesn't bother me. So yeah, 2 of the leading world scientists were going to be flown over, clubbed no doubt, and put in. And they said, oh, but we've got to control the meeting, Paul, because we can't afford to lose this. And I've got this on Zoom, by the way. This was recorded. And I said, I will accept only an independent chair because I want 50% of the time. I don't want this. And what you just said is unacceptable. And it collapsed. And this person, the producer, didn't know about climate. And he said to me, what is the hockey stick? And that. So I did a video on what the hockey stick is and the whole of all of that. So I deal with the top people, believe me, through the world. I really do. And I know what they're like. But there's lots more to get through. Any questions? Any more questions on this at this stage? That was a good question. Thank you. Yeah. You're stuck again.
Hello, another question. The IPCC, which the politicians are relying on for all their information, and our friend Paul as well, I noticed that in chapter 12 of their 1,000-page.
Can I stop you there because I'm discussing this in detail?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Stop you there. There's a lady here wanted to have a...
Yeah, sure.
So because I'm going into that in detail, so I don't want to answer it. Okay.
Hello. I was just wondering, the graph that you showed of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere over such a long period, what do you think caused those huge fluctuations?
Oh, I can tell you. First of all, it's very complex, but there's lots of historic events. So ice ages in the recent times cause this, because when the water cools, the oceans have 50 times more CO2 in them than the atmosphere. So when we get cooling, the oceans suck in CO2 and reduce the atmosphere. So in an ice age, it gets down, the last glaciation, because we are still in ice age, but technically the last glaciation, it went down to 180. Now, had we not increased it, the next glaciation, it probably got to 150 and killed everyone. And that's only 2,000 or 3,000 years away, maybe in 50 years, we don't know, right? You haven't got much long before we're all going to be covered in ice, by the way. And that is just a fact, right? So what was the question?
Why you thought there was such huge fluctuations?
Oh, yeah. So ice ages is one. Glaciations is one. But also, life, when it evolved, changed, you see. So when you went in the Cambrian, there were no trees. All the life was in the ocean. The land was barren. And then someone got the idea of calling out the sea and so on. And vegetation started on land. Now, that sucks in CO2. And so you get that. So what happens is you got a huge explosion of life and it reduces CO2. Right, so the trees reduce CO2. And notice it was the end of the Carboniferous period for those trees when we got the lowest level of CO2. It's more complex than I'm saying, but I'm just giving you some samples of why it changes, yes? So what the alarmists do is just they'll say 100,000 years or not. It's a little period. There's different ways of measuring the CO2. There's also stomata. There's little holes in the leaves that breathe in the CO2. And if they're short of CO2 like they are now, they are because our plants evolved in between 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 parts per million. They've got 420 today. They evolved in that. So what do we do in a greenhouse? We shove the CO2 in, right? That's what we do, right? And you can count the stomata and age CO2, and you get totally different results, by the way, if you go back with stomata results to if you go back with the other ways of doing it. So there's different, you get into all sorts of subjects, yeah? Well, good question, thank you. Move on, yes, sorry. I'm going to be kinder, I promise, right?
You explained glaciations there without reference to the Milankovitch cycles.
Yes, I did. Good question. The point that has just been made is I mentioned glaciations in there for sucking in the CO2, which they do, but I didn't mention what caused the glaciations and the Milankovitch cycles. Well, I didn't mention it because it wasn't part of the subject. What I'm showing is the history of CO2 and temperatures, basically, linking those. And so there was no need to discuss it. Otherwise, I could go on with every graph into all sorts of side subjects. So this is just a side subject. It's not to do with what I'm about. But I have to show him that, there are these cycles. So I go through them to make him aware that I'm aware, but they're not anything to do with the subject. The question is, I explained the glaciations, but I didn't mention the Milankovitch cycles. And this is a story of powerful women. In the First World War, all the men went to war. And there was a Serbian professor who wanted to work out the path of the Earth and the Sun, so. But he needed computers. So he employed 100 women mathematicians in Serbia, yeah? And they spent ages, God, what a job. And they literally did millions and hundreds of millions of calculations. And what they found was, and there's little doubt about this, no one really disagrees, that there are three main cycles. Now, one cycle is, there's the Sun. By the way, the Earth, just to tell you, the Earth doesn't go around the Sun. The Earth goes around a Barry point, not the Sun. If I've got let me tell you, if I've got a Sun and a planet, or two suns revolving around each other, we'd be revolving about the midpoint, yes? And if I had a smaller planet, it'd be much nearer to the Sun. And the Sun actually revolves around a point just outside the Sun, where it revolves, because of the big planets pull the Sun, and the Sun pulls the planets. So you end up with a point called the Barry point, I think, outside Barry Center, outside the Sun. However, because of that, it actually performs a very complicated path, because that changes with all the planet systems. And actually, the alarmists forgot that, because it changes the distance a lot. And a Professor Zarkov, a woman, in Northumbria University, analysed it, couldn't believe they hadn't allowed for this, because it's been well known for 100 plus years. So she allowed for it, and it made a big difference. And she's forecasting that between now and 2035, and I agree with her, I've done a video on it, we're going to be cooling. And you'll see why again more in a minute. Okay? So that's that. Any more questions?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
just relating to.
Oh, sorry, it's 3 cycles, didn't do all the cycles. Elliptical, and the other cycle is we're tilted at the moment. That tilt gradually changes over time. That's the first one's 100,000 years. The next one about 40,000 years is, and the next one 22,000 years. And that's the wobble, like a top when it's spinning and going wobbly, right? So I always forget the names of the words. They're the 3 cycles.
Precession.
Pardon?
Precession.
Yes, that's right, precession. And so, because I'm getting old, I forget words. Precession. So that's your Milankovitch cycles, and they're in it. And I did say there are many more factors in it. That's why I can't give. I could spend a whole night on one graph, right? I'm not going to do that. But good point, thank you.
Okay, the point I was making was that the glaciations over the last 800,000 years have been running every 100,000 years, which matches the first of those cycles, the orbital eccentricity of the planet. We get closer and further away. But the other graph you showed, and this is the more serious question really, and it ties in with the quote that you had on at the very, very, very start about the 40th of a millionth or whatever, and you were showing how the measurements of climate in the CO2 in the atmosphere is rising, but you said it hadn't made any difference to the temperature.
No, I didn't say that. Just a note here for clarity: the graph I just shown was a graph of CO2 against time, how CO2 has risen over time. It didn't mention or even relate to temperature. It was just a graph of what everyone agrees is the CO2 rise against time. It had the metings on to show that the metings had no effect on that rise of CO2. I said all the COP meetings and everything made no difference to the rise of CO2. I haven't even mentioned temperatures and coming up to it. Okay, so you misunderstood.
Okay, the graphs of the action being taken to reduce CO2 was making no difference, is what you were saying.
No, all the political meetings in the world and all the conferences haven't even dented the curve of rising CO2.
But you know why that is, don't you? Because until we have got down to zero emissions, we will not see a reduction in anything.
I'll go into that, won't we?
The amount of
No,
carbon.
I think you're a great representative because you're asking really good questions, right? And I will be dealing with this.
Okay.
So please give me time to come up to the subject as I come up to CO2.
And just to pick up
And you can
this
bring
point,
this back.
the
Okay, next one.
40th of a millionth of 1 degree centigrade was your word, that it would make difference. That is because that's only taking us up to the point where we get down to net zero and then have to wait between 300 and 1,000 years before the carbon in the atmosphere starts to fall.
Yes, there's a lot of
and that's why
assumptions
this
here.
is such a serious
Yeah,
issue.
I know,
What we're
but
running
I'm just
into...
saying how much. Yeah, fine. So let's accept that I don't think you're right, but let's accept you're right because I said assuming they are right. It's still a 40th millionth of a degree.
Only until we reach the end of the 300 to 1,000 years, and then the
Oh, in
levels of
1,000
carbon
years,
will
it'll get
start to
better.
fall.
Well,
It'll
everyone.
take a long time, yes.
Yeah, and he's right.
That's
He may
why
be
we
right.
need
I'm
to
accepting
act
this at the moment. But you see what I mean? I call this a wormhole because
Can you hold the microphone?
what he's saying is that when I started the meeting tonight, I mentioned you'll save a 40th millionth of 1 degree if you actioned it here. And he's saying, well, that's right, because it take up 300 to 1,000 years before we see the effect, before we lose the CO2. Now, I did say this was according to their calculations. Okay? So, okay, that's why you'll only save a 40th millionth. But things will improve, maybe in 1,000 years. Okay?
Can't wait.
Pardon?
Can't wait.
No, you can't wait. So I call it a wormhole because this is a good question from a knowledgeable person, and I wish I could spend the evening doing it, but I can't because I've got to encapsulate. I've got lots of surprises coming, I promise, right? The biggest one is CO2. I'm going to have to move on, okay? But I want you to come back on that. Now, there, I think the gentleman was confused. The chart I showed was this one, and it was a chart showing how all the COP conferences, etc., don't dent the CO2 rise. They have no effect. So all the meetings and all the hot air has no effect. CO2 is going to rise, and it's going to rise regardless of what you do, because the Far East and India and China, etc., are going to carry on, and I don't blame them, and they're going to thankfully produce a lot more CO2. That's what I was showing. Nothing to do with it not affecting temperatures, just the meetings and what effect they have on the growing CO2, which is none. That was the first point. The second point that's being made here is, well, I could go into it a little bit. I'll just go into it a little bit. The alarmists think there's a difference between man-made CO2, which lasts like 1,000 years, and natural CO2, which lasts 4 years or so before it recycles. Now, there's a whole subject there to go into. I don't believe that's the case, by the way, but there's a whole subject to go into. But it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. What the original meeting showed, the thing I had on the screen when everyone walked in, was that if the Isle of Man disappeared, basically, they'd save 1/40th millionth of 1 degree centigrade, according to the alarmist calculations. That's all I was making the point of. That no matter what you do, you're going to have no effect, basically, on it. But that is the case, I'm afraid, for even if Africa sank, if America sank, South America, Europe all sank, it would still continue to rise, the CO2. And so the whole campaign is virtue signaling. That's really the point I was making. But he was going into the length of time carbon lasts in the atmosphere. It's irrelevant to the point I'm trying to make in the meeting. So I just thought I'd explain that.
Oh, I'm going to get to extreme weather. You know the world has gone to hell in a high cart. It really has. You're getting weather that you've never experienced. You're going to be burnt up. You're going to be stormed out. All the islands are going to sink. The poor polar bears, well, they've just gone. Right? You've had all this alarmism fed to you. And I realised it. I'm 79, so I realised the other day, someone who was about 15 in 2000 when all this madness really got going, wouldn't be really, they'd be into boys and girls and all that, but they wouldn't really be into climate. And when they get to about 18 or 20, so let's take a 15 or 2000, they'd be now 39. And they're being subjected to all this propaganda. And I'm now going to dispel it. And you know who I'm going to be using? I'm going to be using the biggest authorities in the world to explain the falsehood of extreme weather. Okay? There we go. So, that's extreme weather, yeah? And now I'm going to use extreme weather in the Isle of Man. How about that? I thought I'd start with that because I don't know how you've all lost your tans from the hottest May on record. But yeah, you don't seem to be that. I'm not being rude, but you certainly haven't, come in front of me as a baking thing in May. And actually, the headline of this isn't bad because whoever wrote the headline, I don't know who these people are, wasn't bad because he used the word warmest. Because the world's getting less hot, but it's getting warmer according to the records. And there's a difference between warm and hot. And what this says is that it says the lack of cold nights because they were 2.5 above average. Now I've got news for you. If you put a thermometer on an airport, if you put a thermometer alongside a runway on an airport, like you do here, the radiation heats all that millions of bloody square miles of tarmac and concrete, and so at night it keeps the heat, it holds the heat and raises your lower temperature. And all temperatures in the world are very simply calculated. The top and the lowest for each day halved. So if it's warmer at the bottom, it makes it a higher temperature. Yeah? That's how it works. And what you've got, honestly reported here, because you did a good job, you didn't use hot, you used warm, because it wasn't hot, right? And the next thing, rainfall was above average, but you only had 15% sunshine. So you managed to get hot. You managed to get hot without the sunshine. And that's why it explains the tans, yes? And sunshine is pretty important because that's where all our energy comes from, yeah? So I just wanted to remember that. But in actual fact, not a bad thing. not a bad report, because he didn't say hottest. America has been cooling for decades, by the way, and most of the world is cooling. Right, but I've got to move on. I don't think that's a video. This is a video, and this is still on the Isle of Man. We'll be dealing with this subject, of course, of extreme weather, and in particular some of your Isle of Man claims, like the hottest May. I'm sorry that all of you in the Isle of Man apparently have suffered from a super hot May, a record May. That is ridiculous. And if you're basing those temperatures on your runway here, this is the actual temperature gauge in the Stevenson screen right alongside the runway. You cannot use temperatures from that thermometer. And nor can you use temperatures when there's less than 1 meter a second of air through that Stevenson screen. So there are videos on this. Here's a link to one that go into much more detail. It is ridiculous what you're doing. The record temperature in the UK was from a temperature gauge right alongside the runway at Heathrow Airport. And for the record, that record temperature in May you had was not because it was hotter, but because it was warmer at the temperature gauge, and it's warmer overnight because of all the infrastructure around it retains the heat overnight. It's called the urban heat island effect, and the alarmists use it all the time to deceive you on temperature. So it's quite possible for a temperature, the top temperature, the hottest temperature, to be lower, and the lowest temperature to be higher and give you a record temperature. It's a ridiculous way of misleading you. Large areas of tarmac, like runways, absorb a lot of heat during the day. You can even see heat haze over them in the day. That tarmac gives a buffer of warmth at night and raises the minimum temperature, and by doing so raises the average temperature for the day. And in the case of your May hottest temperature, it was the minimum temperatures that were higher, not the highest temperatures. Okay, there's more. Records are a funny thing, aren't they? The longest temperature record in the world as a place is called the Central England Temperature Record. So someone just went and analysed it. This is on the Met Office site, by the way. And May 1883 was 1 degree centigrade hotter than now, based on Met Office records, because someone just looked back. They're rushing to keep the money flowing, and the only way they keep the money flowing is to scare you, right? The data doesn't support it. That's my source, the Central England Temperature Record, and 1883 was a whole 1 degree. You know what? They talk about 0.1 and 0.5. We'll come to that because the temperature measurements are ridiculous, right? So there we are for that. And between 2016 and 2022, the Earth very slightly cooled. That's according to Hadcrud 4. You want the source? Hadcrud 4, right? And it's just a very slow decline in average temperatures. You see, the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final most essential command. George Orwell, 1984. It's so relevant. So relevant. Right. We've had 16. Right. There's a thing called the this is global RSS global mean temperatures, and the sources are there. I've given the link and everything. Right. And again, there's been no global warming for 16 years since 1998. It's been like that up and down. There are cycles, by the way. I'll be explaining some of them, but there's been no global warming. Right. And yet, CO2 is an incredibly good gas for warming the Earth. That seems to clash. I know what I've just said seems to clash. You'll find out why. And let's look at droughts. Now, that was my job. I was the water resource engineer for Wales in the 76 when we had the biggest drought in our living memory. Yeah? But you'll see reports like, worst drought in 30 years hit South Africa. I can't help the spelling there where they missed out the H because that's directly from a BBC website. You know, right? But that was the worst drought 30 years ago. I could put that another way. 30 years ago, there was a worse drought than there was this year. When they say it's the worst since, always remember it was worse before. Yeah, I just put that out. This is a video. This is my work together with the Environment Agency in the UK agree with it. And this is a list of the worst droughts in UK history. But the worst drought actually occurred, this one, the first one, which was really bad. It went on for 18 months. Covered Ireland everywhere, covered everywhere, right? Really bad. We have nothing since. It stands out as the mega drought. So I've listed all the worst droughts in Britain, right up to date, as it were, right? And this is it. It's only a short video of this. So you can see the worst ones were way back in the past. And I've got some news for you. The biggest droughts are caused by cold weather, not hot weather. The biggest droughts are caused by cold weather because there's less moisture in the air in cold weather. Everyone agrees with that. So in the middle of the Ice Age's coming scare, when I was the water resource managing that drought in Wales, was 1976. Right in the middle of the ice is, we're going to have to melt the ice in the Arctic. We're going to have to put coal power and get the sun to absorb and melt it, and all this rubbish. 100 scientists wrote to the President of the United States, we've got to act. We've got to take action. Yes? It was a cold decade, and we had that brilliant summer, 1976, which some of you may remember, right? Not everyone, but I do. And that was way down the list. That was way down the list. And that was the biggest in my memory, sort of thing. So there's the list. So then I looked up the Environment Agency report in Britain, and they said there is no evidence, well, I disagreed slightly, they said there's no evidence of any increasing drought severity. But that's the UK. How about the rest of the world? I'd just like to remind you of a really bad time, the Great Famine of the 1870s. And by the way, when was that drought we had in Britain? Are you with me? That was then, in that period. And that was 50 million deaths from drought-induced mass starvation across South America, Africa and Asia. It was an all-natural climate event, colder times with lower CO2. So it was much worse than the past. All the extreme weather I'm going to show you was worse before today. And there's good meteorological reasons for that, right? Not more. Here's the US drought index. And what it shows is mid-1930s, when they had the Dust Bowl, that was the worst drought period in the USA. Right? Didn't get worse. Okay? Next one. You've got to understand, in all the official bodies, there's two bodies. There's the scientists and there's the politicians. And the politicians rule, not the scientists. And not more so than in the Met Office, who are terrible. They love giving out stories. A recent story like this. New research shows increasing frequency of extreme rain. Extreme rainfall events could, there's often a may or a could be 4 times as frequent by 2080. This is like my turbulence bloke with the thing when I proved him wrong. He's really upset because I proved him wrong with observation. So that's what they say. So let's go to the Met Office record. Now, this is the Met Office, from the British Met Office. This is the source. Yeah, Hacker Grid. And you can go to the Met Office now, it's still there, and print it out. Okay? Okay, and it's the annual rainfall amounts. Okay? I'll play the video and then we'll discuss. So with rainfall, what do you get? It has got a blank on for the intro, but it will eventually hit in.
It's just like rainfall. We've actually increased rainfall average since 1850, but at the same time, we've reduced the extremes. So we don't get the big droughts of the 1800s, nor do we get the big floods of the 1800s. The range has become less. We have less extreme weather.
That's the nature of it. Because we've warmed. And do the alarmists want us to go, what period do they want? Some have said to me, no, I want it back to pre-industrial. Well, first of all, we'd have massive starvation on Earth because we've got record crops at the moment. I'll be going into that. But secondly, do you want to go back to that world? No. Right? No. It was warming well before. Sorry? No? Right. So I'm just showing you, actually go to the data and you look at what they say, and what they say is different to the data all the time. And that's what I do, big style. You'll see this big style in a minute, where what they say and what actually is, the data behind them are different. The International Journal of Climatology stated, people are moaning about the Great Storm of October 87. Any comparison of storms is complex, it says. This is the Royal Meteorological Society in Britain. These are the people who certified meteorologists, which upset my opponent on GB News when it turned out he wasn't certified. Yeah, but never mind, there's this whole story there. Storm, I'll print it, I'll read it out. Storm Eustace was the most severe storm to affect England and Wales since February 2014. Everyone was panicking, yes? But even so, these storms of the 1980s and 1990s were much more severe. So, this is the Royal Meteorological Society in Britain stating that in the 80s and 90s we had a worse time on storms by far than we had since 2000 to date. Again, I'm using official data. And now I'll explain why. And this is why. You realise we've only warmed by 1.3, 1.4, whatever you want to call it, since the Little Ice Age. Yeah? In fact, it was colder than that before. But as I say, we were warming 150 years before mankind started pumping in CO2. There's a thing called the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. You see this map of the world? There's a cycle of 70 years. 35 years cold, 35 years warm. It's called the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. That's what it is. So from the equator right up to the poles, the ocean suddenly warms by 0.55 C and then cools. So it varies a bit, but 30 to 35 years, and then the other way. We had a very warm year, 2023, and that warm year was caused by sea temperatures. It wasn't caused by land. The land was actually cooler. So if you go around the world, it was a warm year. It was the warmest year since 79. Nothing like the 1930s and things. But, so imagine that warms, you see? And now, when you've got the colder period, this oscillation started to warm around about 1995, And that's when we got fewer storms. And we got more storms when it was colder. The reason is dead simple. The whole of weather is about difference. If you've got a difference in pressure, wind. If you've got a difference in temperature, it'll dissipate. Everything in science tries to level out all the time. Yeah? The bigger the difference, the more severe the weather. If you've got the climate, if you've got a hot equator, which we always have, and you've got a warm northern part, there's less difference. So there's less hurricanes, there's less temperature gradient. The job of a hurricane is to take the heat from the tropics and shove it up in north. I want to cool down. That's the job of a hurricane, right? So that is the reason why the Royal Meteorological Society said this is the case. I try to give you the background reasoning to everything I do. There is nothing I do, which is why I'm on telly and things now, because I'm just telling you the truth. And I challenge anyone, and I'm willing to admit I'm wrong. Because if I'm wrong about something, I don't want to carry on in ignorance. I want to carry on right. And there's nothing wrong in a scientist being wrong. There's something wrong in them not discussing it or not accepting skepticism. They're not a scientist, in my view, then. You can't be a scientist and say I'm closed off. But all I had on the radio today was, assertions of that. And now you can't do it. So there's the reason. And I've done a whole video on the multi-decadal, I can never say it, the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, right? And by the way, there's the reference at the bottom. Okay? There's the reference at the bottom. Right. We all know about the increase in forest fires, don't we? Yeah? Do we accept you've been told that forest fires are getting worse and worse? Or is that what you've been told? Do everyone agree?
Well, looking at this graph and how forest fires are growing, maybe one should be concerned. Well, be concerned until you realise, and you go back in time with this graph, that what we're suffering now from is nothing compared to the past, as you can see. But more important, when President Biden came into power, he had all this part of the graph deleted from the official records. This is intentional hiding of historic data.
And that's from the government agencies, this. Yeah, you can't get away with that because he didn't realise we got all copies of it before they did that. Yes? And that is absolutely true, right? So we know that in the US, we know by the official, and by the way, people have said maybe they didn't measure the acreages back then well. Of course they bloody did. You paid money for it. People could measure farms. Believe me, a farmer would argue about that's my yard and all that way back then, right? So that's the case. But that's America. What about the world? Well, global areas band. The references are on the bottom. Journal of Geophysical Research, a respected body. There's the top graph, global areas band 1901 to 2018. On the bottom is global areas band by decade, declining since the 1900s. These are official records that you They don't want you to know, right? Not my data. All the way through, not my data. All the way through. Anyone can send me an email, you didn't do this, Paul, you didn't give me the source, I'll supply it, right? Because there's no point in me lying, is there? You know, I'm not nutty. I don't do this in the world and put myself in a lot of pain and travel and everything to lie to people, right? So that's interesting, isn't it? But there's another authority involved in all the scare stories, NASA. You know NASA? Yep.
How do you manage to have a negative value for the amount, for the
How do you manage to have a negative value where?
Your graph goes negative.
The top one and the bottom one?
The top one. How's it work?
Oh, no, it's not that negative. I see. Well, no, that's how they plotted the data recently.
Yeah, but
and they got a mean out of it.
But what does it mean that you have a negative -1 million kilometers squared burned in a year? What does that mean?
Let me have a look at that. That's a really good question.
Perhaps it's just I can't see the subtitle on that axis.
Yeah, it might be. But I've just used the official records from the Journal of Geophysical Research. They did it a different way there at the bottom with the histogram. I don't understand that. I'm going to find out. If you email me.
Is it not just a deviation from a level that they've taken?
And maybe. I don't know how they've done. I don't know why they've stuck it on there because they had good records. So why have they gone? And maybe the claims that have been made. I don't know. So I've got to read. I can't read all that actually. So, but it's a really good question. And sir, if you email me, the card's there. I'll give you the answer.
That question did catch me out. I did not give him an answer and he didn't email me, so I'm now going to give him the answer in this video. Right, this is the graph I showed on the night, and what it showed was the measured line in black, which is how it's traditionally measured, the burnt acreage, and also the orange one is just the more recent satellite measurements, which are the same thing, they confirm it. So there's no doubt about reducing acreage of burnt area worldwide. However, the first graph, the one that I showed on the night, was an anomaly. In other words, it was comparing the acreage to the period from 2000 to 2007, and I couldn't read that at the time. So here it is here. And so if you take that as the average, you can have above and below that 7 years. And that's what it first one. So I'll now show you the graph without that, just in the absolute burnt acreages. It's the same result. So it's not deceiving in any way, and that's the answer to that young gentleman, and he was quite right to raise it, and I'm thankful that he did.
Is it not obvious just variation from mean?
It could be, yes, it could be. But they've derived a mean, but they know exactly what the acreage is burnt. It isn't a guess. So this question is totally valid. Okay, so what did NASA say? NASA say, globally, the total acreage burned by fires each year declined by 24% between 1998 and 2015, according to NASA satellite data. There's the links, dropping global fires, June 29, 2017. So in those years, a 24% drop in global fires. Right? So we got the Royal we got respected bodies telling you there's less and less forest fires. But you have a perception that it's getting worse. Right? This is a good one. I don't know why I did that, because maybe I just like the sea or something, but I have sailed around the world on my own boat, and things like that. But I just like the sea, because really that didn't do anything except give you a title. I'll have to do something about that. Right, this is the history of sea levels. When there was, I once asked on the radio, a student of climate, I once asked him, he was in his second or third year, and I once asked him how much the sea level would rise if all the Arctic melted, which is a very simple answer, by the way. Most humans know it, I hope. It wouldn't change at all because it's floating, right? Only ice from the land increases sea level, right? Which is why when you put all the ice in the glass and everything, it will just melt. All it does is replace its old hull. It sinks in, it's 9/10 under the water roughly, and as it melts, it's less dense, and as it melts, it fills the hull, it's the same sea level. But off a glacier, and by the way, this coughing of glaciers that you watch is a really good sign, because it means the glaciers coming down like in Greenland are flowing. They're all flowing, slow-flowing rivers. You should be worried if it's not making it there, right? So it started off, and this is the video, so I can play it and it'll explain itself. This is my lazy way of doing it. So this graph is of post-glacial sea level rise. That's since the last glaciation, when we had the half a mile of ice, whatever it was, over Birmingham, and it all melted. And that melting ice, which was on land, because melting ice in the sea like the Arctic doesn't count, but the on land ice that melts raises sea levels. And it rose rapidly here until it sort of slowed down eventually. It had done its melt, and about 8,000 years ago or so, it started this gradual sea level rise, which we're now in. But hold on here, the graph really isn't big enough to show it, but this tiny amount here in this 24,000 year cycle is apparently due to us. So let's look at that in more detail. Right? So it's really a hoax, and this is the record. I think they claim it's the longest sea level record in the world. It's from Germany, and it's a straight line. And that straight line shows no increase or change. So if it was changing, and if we were warming and changing, that would curve upwards, but it doesn't. So a straight line on a tide gauge does not show warming anywhere. So next point. Hold on, this one shows dropping. Not cause, the sea level's still rising, but that's Sweden. Now in Scotland, when the ice was there, you've taken the ice off, the land actually rebounds. So Scotland's rising. The south of England's sinking, right? Canada is rising. The east coast of America is sinking, yeah? So you get differences by that. But what matters is not that level. It's not that it's dropping. The sea's still rising by about 2 millimeters a year, roughly. But it's a straight line. And no matter where you look, these are cities around the world, and they're all straight lines. All that matters is the shape of the line. So no matter where, there's no evidence of rising sea levels caused by mankind whatsoever. But we've got a magician here, he's called Barack Obama. And I'll quote, when he took the inauguration to be president, when he was nominated to be president, he wrote this. This was the moment when the rise of oceans began to slow and the planet began to heal. Barack Obama, upon winning the Democratic nomination for president, conveys his thinking of what that means for the world, Tuesday, June 3rd, 2008. But when he finished his presidency, because he was born in Hawaii, he bought one in Martha's Vineyard, of course, which everyone knows about, right by the sea. But this one is classic. This is his house in Hawaii with the sea lapping his garden wall. But don't worry, because he stopped it. Right? This is what you've got to put up with. The current spokesman for American climate change flew all the way to Iceland to get an award. Just to get an award, how good he was, in his private jet and back. Just for an award. You're expected to suck up to all this. That's ridiculous. The hypocrisy is incredible. But there's sinking islands, isn't there? Now, the BBC called one island I sailed to the most remote island in the world. It was only a metre above the sea level, by the way. And the Maldives, they were sinking, weren't they? Despite the fact the Chinese are building multi-billion-pound airports a metre above sea level, they're all sinking. And so let's look at sinking islands. The most prone island in the world for sinking is Tuvalu. Yeah? Tuvalu, this last year, the most prone island in the world, desperate. Let's get some money. So the leader sits in some coral with a desk and asks everyone for money. Yeah?
So here we have the leader of Tuvalu, a little island in the Pacific, destined to be the most prone island to sink in the world. And the leader here is appealing for more money. But the facts are, 1. Tuvalu has grown by 2.9%. But not only that, hundreds of Pacific islands and Indian Ocean islands have grown. It's all fake news.
And Darwin noticed this. Darwin noticed that coral islands grow. Right? He wrote about it in his book, right? And it's well known. And there aren't any. And you'll hear claims of, and I think we have a lady from that part of the world here actually, but the Solomons. But you'll hear claims that some 5 islands have gone in the Solomons. You have sandbanks, they can get a few palm trees on them. No people living there. And they'll be taken away by wind or storms and they'll reappear somewhere else. Don't count them. We're talking, there are no populated islands have gone, right? So all that is fake. And all the reports show, in fact, quite a few of them in the Indian Ocean grew by 8%. Yeah? So again, going to the facts, just not true, but that doesn't stop the leaders asking for more money, because more money is going to be a key as I develop this. Questions? Yes?
It's not really about what you've been talking about now, but it's been on my mind, going back to the wind farm that they're planning on creating on the island. Mm-hmm. What effect is that going to have on the island's diversity, the wildlife, our biosphere rating and everything? Because I think that's what residents are really concerned about.
You're coming up to it.
You are, right.
I do cover this. Okay, we'll move on. You got a question there?
I think what you're about to witness here is a question that basically the question is denying the effect of the urban heat island effect. The Royal Meteorological Society itself says London or such cities can be much higher in temperature than the surrounding areas. The urban heat island effect is a simple fact. But there was a study by Berkeley, the Center of Alarmism in California, and that tried to dispense the idea of an urban heat island effect. So what you're supposed to believe is there isn't one. And this really fascinated me, that this gentleman goes as far as to try to produce evidence denying the urban heat island effect. It is undeniable. But I ask you to appeal to common sense. If you have a lot of concrete and tarmac and things around you, then the heat from that in the night is going to raise the temperature at night. We've already dealt with some of that. And nearly all the records are at airports. I mean, in the UK, the top 3 records were at 3 airports. That's not a coincidence. There's a lot of tarmac there. It retains the heat and it gives it off at night. A lot of animals know about that and use it.
You mentioned the urban heat island effect there, the fact that this is often due to where meteorological stations are based on tarmac or something. Presumably you're familiar with the Berkeley study, the Berkeley Earth surface data. They're best known as BEST. I think the guy that led it was a guy called Mueller. In the early 2000s, he set out to prove with a group at the Berkeley BEST lab in California that the climate changes were due to dodgy Met officers. And they were analysing Met officers around the world. They identified some where they thought maybe the Met officers were a bit too close to tarmac or whatever. And they carried out the full analysis of this. And at the end of it, the scientists were surprised that they had to accept they had not been able to prove that the change in temperatures was due to that. Indeed, their data showed that the Met officers they'd identified as perhaps dodgy had actually warmed less than average. So it was the exact reverse of what they've been trying to prove. So that doesn't hold. And then you talked about the 16...
Before you go on to the next one?
Sorry?
It'd be easier to answer that before you go on to the next point?
Yeah, okay. If I mention what the next one was, you might want to take them together, but you argued that the 16 cold years after 1998, and none of the data I see supports that. There were 5 colder years, and they were very much tied up with the very powerful...
That's because the data... Okay, 2 points
in the South Pacific.
I can combine the answer to that. Okay. First of all, the Connellys, a group of scientists, took Europe and they removed all the ones that had urban heat island effects. They looked at the temperature graph, and then you had the warming 1930s, warmer than today, and everything came back. Right, so a lot of studies have been done on this. That study, I believe, is fundamentally flawed, right? But no, you can't say that, because I can counter it with studies. And I'm happy, again, if you write to me, to give you all the counter things on that. There's overwhelming information. But there's also common sense. Can I tell you something? There was a Freedom of Information request to the Met Office. And they said, how many of your stations in the Met Office are good? Right? By world meteorological standards. There's 5 classes. In the British Met Office, only 13.7% were class 1 and 2, which could read to within 1 degree. The ones they use for the alarmism could not read to within 5 degrees. Fact. I've done a video on it, and this is official data. I don't know where I've covered it in this coming up, actually, but it's a fact that only 13.7% were accurate. Right. Let me explain something. I used to be in charge of this. On a Stevenson screen, it's ventilated, yes? And unless you get the air passing through, it overheats, regardless of urban heat island now. Forget the urban heat island, it overheats. To get a 1 metre a second through with a gradient and air and the drag, you need 22 miles an hour at 10 metres. Very often it's below that. Very often it's below that when the high's over the country. So even that is not being obeyed. And you can't read to 0.1s of a degrees and things. If you think what you're claiming to this is you put a temperature gauge in the middle of Heathrow, right by the runway there, with all the vehicles and everything, and all that buildings and heat, which moves all around, that doesn't have any effect on the minimum temperature. Is that what you're claiming?
I think they can measure accurately, and they're not reading it by eye, they're reading it by computer.
No, yes, but you're claiming something that common sense says is not true for a start. But there's an overwhelming evidence against this. This is a controversy, by the way, inside climate science, what you're mentioning, right? And you are saying something that really defies common sense. It really does. If you have temperature gauges on a runway with all that traffic, but most of all with all that heat being absorbed by radiation, which has to be released as it cools overnight, that warms the lowest temperature. And where the records, and I've got detailed studies on this, taking all the records in Europe they could get hold of, thousands of records, and removing the urban heat island ones, and suddenly they get the true pattern of what the temperatures were. So I totally reject what you're saying, but I'm very happy for, again, you to email me and allow me to give you my scientific evidence to counter that report, because I do dispute it. Okay, and again, you'll find it's based on models. Right, but you know, it isn't the way they do it statistically and so on, and that. The way they do that is flawed. But you don't accept that, and that's fair enough. I think you sensible question, great question. You had some good questions, but common sense would tell you that you can't have. In fact, if you fly over, if you watch my video, in fact, all you have to do is watch my video. I gave a link to it when I went on about temperatures, and that, if you watch that video, there are three videos I would want people to watch, and that really covers it. And one of them is that, and it's about temperatures, and I cover the subject in that. Watch that, and then write to me. You've got my email. And say, I dispute it, here's the study, answer that. And I'll do that for you. Okay, that's all I can do.
Okay, I just find it incredible that you're saying that with the technology we have, it's not possible to measure temperature to within 1 degree. I used to have a Stevenson screen when I taught in the school grounds, and we could measure to within that, and we were happy.
I'm sorry, no, you take a reading within that, you couldn't measure. Were you aware that you needed 22 miles an hour of wind at 10 metres in order to get a reliable measure? Were you aware of that?
I haven't read that.
No, you see, you don't know the subject. So I'm sorry, but this.
But I'm not sure that that's accepted science.
It's totally accepted by Stevenson when he did it for a start. That is not like new. This is basic meteorological data collection, right? It's basic meteorological data collection, which people forget about these days. You've got all these kids trying to get nice grants doing climate, and they forget about the fundamentals. And it makes common sense if you think about it. If you haven't got a draft through that screen, all you're doing in a hot day is heating up a little box and making it hotter. You've got to have that ventilation. So I'm telling you what the science says. I'm telling you what the specification of a Stevenson screen says. What are you telling me back? You don't think it's right. That's not science.
I'm telling you that I've got greater faith in the competence of their thousands of weather observers who are living day by day, taking these figures and
so you deny the World Meteorological Organisation?
Well, the head of our own Met Office gave an analysis on.
Yeah, I know. They said in reaction to this, when it was pointed out only 13.7%, they said we still believe ours. Correct. You're right. They said that. The World Meteorological Office, who do it, said wrong. Right? 5 degrees difference on a class 5. That's the class 4 and 5 they use for the alarm. Now, there's a video on it. People can watch my video. And I printed out on the screen there earlier, the thing, right? But it's one of my recent videos. And it'll say something about extreme weather climate, when I say temperature, and a dash temperature at the end. And it goes into great detail on the subject. Okay? What you're doing, by the way, is an appeal to authority. Doesn't work.
I don't think that's true that I'm appealing to authority. I'm appealing to the world. Well, I gave one example, but this is the world meteorologists, not climatologists, meteorologists measuring the weather day by day. Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about, the World Meteorological Society. Anyway, we disagree on this because I'm willing, watch my videos on it, I give all the details, the sources, and so on. You can't argue that unless there's ventilation properly through the screen. Or if you put a box outside with a temperature gauge in a hot day, it's going to be hotter inside the box than outside. It's as simple as that. You've got to have ventilation, and it's got to be in shade. That's what a Stevens screen is designed for. It's not me. That's the way it's always been. Any other questions? I really do want people to follow up on these, which is why I printed the email on.
So just to clear up on that point, trying to get basics across to people sometimes is very difficult. I mean, people reading thermometers to a fraction of a degree is fine, but if the reading itself is wrong, which is what I'm talking about, that's what's critical. And just to make it absolutely clear about that 1 meter a second of ventilation, ISO 17714, International Organization for Standardization 2007, simply assumes a ventilation rate of 1 meter a second within the modern Stevenson type screens. So there it is. It's an ISO, it's a standard. He just didn't know it, that's all.